It ends with Us, directed by Justin Baldoni, stars Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, and Brandon Sklenar. The summary for this movie says the following. Lily overcomes a traumatic childhood to embark on a new life. A chance meeting with a neurosurgeon named Ryle sparks a connection. Lily begins to see sides of him that remind her of her parents' relationship. I honestly had no interest in seeing this movie. I saw the trailer for it and thought it looked like every other generic shitty romance drama that almost felt a decade too late from the way the trailers was edited. But apparently, I'm one of the few people who has been under a rock, as the book that this movie was based off of is considered to be very popular, despite the writer itself being a controversial person, along with being a pretty bad writer too. But to my surprise, in my local theater, there was floods of lines waiting to check this movie out. The lines of which mainly consisted of middle-aged wine moms and teenage girls that are probably addicted to TikTok, as this book has gotten popular on the book talk side of TikTok, as people began to discuss the work, whether that be in a positive or negative light. I can't say for sure. So what did I, a 21-year-old straight man, think of this movie? You can probably guess. I'll start by talking about the performances. First off, I think Blake Lively did a pretty terrible job in this role. She delivers every line of dialogue for the majority of it as if she's downed a bottle of sleeping pills before every take. She always sounds so uninterested and constantly slurred her words. I really felt like she was sleeping through the whole performance, which made for a pretty hard watch. Along with this, she's playing such a shitty character, which I do feel bad for saying, because for the type of story this movie is portraying, you kind of hope to be rooting for her and sympathizing with her. Well, I'm thankful to say I don't root for anyone in this movie because they are all shitty characters, which I'll get to later. She comes across as incredibly narcissistic and plain unbearable. Early on in the movie, she jokes, in quotation marks, about being an unreliable narrator, and I thought this was actually going to play a part in the structure of the movie, but this didn't exactly happen, at least not the full way I thought it would have. There is something that happens which was very jarring and confusing, which I'll get to later. During her performance, she didn't make an effort to make me care about anything she was doing or what her character was going through, and if you fail to convey this through your performance, shocker, you're doing a bad job. In terms of films this year, Blake Lively presents this character to be lifeless and moronic and doesn't act as the type of character women should look up to when it comes to female characters in cinema. Justin Baldoni, both being the director and star of this movie, plays the love interest named Ryle, which, as it goes on, is supposed to be the bad love interest, one the audience is supposed to hate, as he is supposed to be an abuser. Before I talk about how stupid the movie handles this, I'll talk about the guy's actual performance. He's pretty bad here too. I think the guy should have just stick to directing on this one, because I imagine directing yourself would be a pretty hard thing to do, and this guy just wasn't cut out for doing both roles. Whenever he delivers lines that are meant to seem romantic or even sexy, they come across as unnerving and creepy. And who knows, maybe that's because his character is meant to be revealed as an abuser later on in the movie, but this could have been the intention. But in the early stages of this movie, the writers clearly want to pull in the audience into a false sense of security, which doesn't work, and every line this guy delivers makes me want to throw up. Along with his lines just being terribly written, he and Blake Lively are guilty of not acting out their conversations as if they're real people. Whenever they do these poor attempts at flirting, it seems incredibly superficial and manufactured. It doesn't ever feel like how real adults will flirt with each other, and it just ended up being extremely laughable and hard to sit through. When it comes to the latter half of this movie and we see the guy as an abuser, I suppose he does a serviceable job at acting like how these actual pieces of shit would act. However, due to this film's rating, it doesn't go far enough with what these type of people can do to their partners, which felt very undermining. But he did somewhat a believable job at being capable of doing stuff like this, but other than that, there isn't enough to his performance for me to care about him. Brandon Sklenar plays the quote-unquote good love interest in this movie. I say good in quotation marks, as I'll get into why I don't think he's much better than the supposed abuser in this movie, but I digress. His character is supposed to be the grown-up version of Blake Lively's love interest from when she was younger, and outside of this trait and him having a somewhat successful job, there really isn't much else to his character. That's the thing, essentially, with all of the characters in this. They're all incredibly one-dimensional and have no substantial depth to anything they do. For the whole movie, he acts overly nice, and this is the only way the writers were able to show he's better than the other other guy in the movie. However, you gotta love how while the writers do this, in his introduction scene, when he meets Blake Lively and sees these marks on her, he demands to know how it happened. And while she refuses to say, even though he keeps pushing and pushing, like, it's ironic that the man in this movie that's supposed to be the better option basically can't take no for an answer. Despite these character flaws in the writing, I will admit, out of the three in this love triangle, he is the better actor of the three of them. I didn't find much of his delivery to be poor or anything like that. He did what he could and tried to elevate the writing through his performance, but even with this, he didn't do enough to fully carry the movie. And even with that, his performance only borders on being okay. I will say, maybe I can't say much about his performance, since whenever the guy appeared on screen across from me, this woman in her 40s made it very clear out loud to the entire movie theater that she pretty much creamed in her pants whenever he appeared on screen. Jenny Slate plays Blake Lively's character's friend in this movie, and all I really have to say about her was she was just another actress here whose performance was a little bearable to sit through. She's essentially the main comic relief in this movie, and even though nothing she says in the movie I found to be remotely funny at all, this is more down to the screenplay rather than her actual performance, so I'm not saying that's her fault. Along with delivering the comedy in the movie, there's a point in the end of the movie where they make her deliver an emotional monologue, and I'll admit I think she did a pretty good job at this. Her performance seems believable enough, and while it wasn't enough to make me care about what was actually happening, I can acknowledge that she was at least trying in this part of the movie, at least, thankfully. Now, I have to try and somewhat talk about the other aspects of this movie, but I genuinely don't know where to begin, as there's just so many terrible things presented here. I'll talk about a lot of the choices in the writing that just made me roll my eyes, along with what made the movie such a confusing and grating watch. In the very first scene, Blake Lively meets her mom, and her mom delivers a line of dialogue, which I'll paraphrase because I can't fully remember, but to my recollection is something along the lines of, "I can't believe this thing happened on the day of your father's funeral," which at first when I heard it was so close on bordering to be similar to the line in Madam Web talking about being in the Amazon researching spiders. So when I heard a line that was spoon-feeding exposition into their audience like this, I knew I was in for a wild ride. As the movie kept going, we reached our meet cute, which I've already talked about being utterly unnatural and unrealistic, which bordered on being almost parody. The main thing I want to talk about is how this movie handles the theme of domestic violence. With that alone, I'll say this as a trigger warning for people that are sensitive to hearing about this type of discussion. From what the movie does show, however, it is really tame, which alone is just stupid, but regardless, if you're sensitive to this topic, I'd recommend either checking out one of my other reviews or watch this rest of the video with discretion. The summary for this movie reads as Blake Lively's character having a traumatic childhood, and whether it be for runtime reasons, we really only see two instances of having bad experiences with her father, both of which we never actually see directed to her. This then shows that later in life, from what we can assume to be only 2 times this guy has done something shitty, that she supposedly resents her father for the rest of her life, which is then contradicted at the very end of the movie, as after making a point to not let her abuser boyfriend share custody of their child, she doesn't want her own daughter growing up with what she had to witness growing up. She apparently has no problem bringing her child to her dad's grave. It just seemed incredibly hypocritical from her character. The way this movie touches on the domestic violence theme is nothing short of insulting to actual victims of this terrible crime. There's points where it nearly romanticizes the idea of being in a shitty relationship, which I thought was a horrible message to be peddling to a young demographic that are going to see it. What I found to be very laughable is how they actually portray it themselves. The 2 times Blake Lively's character is abused are framed and executed to be accidents, and then the 3rd time is a genuine actual attack. So up until this moment, I found it strange that they were almost leaning into the fact that these other attacks could be misinterpreted, but then the movie tricks its audience by having new versions of these attacks to make them look like they were done on purpose, and I found this to be an incredibly scummy way to manipulate your audience. It almost gives the impression that they put this in there so some people will go see the movie twice to see if these were actually how the scenes played out. I wouldn't have minded these reshot scenes if they actually told us which perspective actually happened, but we never get a definitive answer, which is why it comes off as so manipulative. I couldn't help but roll my eyes when this segment of the movie happened. Another moment of pretty bad writing is when the couple go to what looks like a karaoke bar. This scene was stupid for 2 reasons. One, the guy is barely actually trying to sing, not out of the actor's lack of talent. It more more so is in context of the movie itself. Even if you didn't know a song for karaoke, you would at least make an attempt. The second reason this scene sucks was the song they chose the guy to sing is the song Praise You by Fatboy Slim. An incredible track, obviously, but not the type of song someone would choose for karaoke. It's a club song to dance to, not to sing. This scene was just so moronic to sit through. Cinematography in this movie is incredibly lifeless and doesn't do anything impressive to try and enhance the story or to make it visually appealing. It's incredibly flat looking, of course, like so many other movies nowadays. I don't expect amazing cinematography from a movie like this regardless, but just seeing so much minimal effort put into it was still disappointing to see. The soundtrack in this movie is pretty bad too, but it's a soundtrack to appeal to the people going to see the movie. I knew it was over when they decided to add in one of Taylor Swift's songs into it. In fairness, on top of everything in this movie being pretty bad, the editing really sucks too. The whole movie basically plays out like one of her music videos. There are 2 moments in this movie where it's edited like a trailer, and it was so mind-boggling to the fact that they did it twice. Overall, to the surprise of no one, I really didn't like this movie. I just think this is an incredibly lifeless and manipulative piece of modern cinema, which probably doesn't help the fact that the author herself isn't a good person at all. Going as far as to defend her son, who has telling SA allegations against him, along with this pretty much capitalizing on domestic violence. A lot of her books share similar themes. She almost released a coloring book based on the book that this movie is based off of, so with all of that in mind, it really doesn't help, and this just further makes the capitalizing aspect much more obvious. They saw that this book was trending on TikTok and they immediately jumped on the opportunity to make a movie about it without putting any actual effort into making somewhat worthwhile. I'm giving It Ends With Us 1 star. This is a terribly acted, awfully written, laughable excuse of a movie that tries to make itself seem more important than it is, while at the same time saying nothing of value to a serious issue real people deal with, and instead seem to care more about profiting off of these themes, as they almost portray it to be an inconvenience on the impressionable audience that will go see it. There's nothing of value here. It's grating and embarrassing, and the worst Swiftie fan you know is gonna shill it to you as if it's the next Citizen Kane. Don't give this movie any money and attention, because I don't think I could bear having to sit through another Colleen Hoover book being turned into a movie again after having to sit through this sorry excuse of a movie.